Today, we will be talking about Australia's housing breaking point, when rent competes with survival. Right now, somewhere in Australia, a family is turning off the heater in the middle of winter. Not because they want to save energy, but because rent is due. A young worker is skipping meals, telling friends they're not hungry, while quietly calculating how many days they can survive before payday. An elderly renter is choosing between medication and electricity. This is not a future warning. This is not an extreme scenario. This is happening now. A new report reveals that the majority of Australians are being forced to choose between paying for housing and basic survival. Not luxuries, not holidays, but food, healthcare, and warmth. If you think this crisis affects other people, the data says otherwise. If you think this is temporary, the trends say it's getting worse. And if you think the system will fix itself, you may already be too late. This is Australia's housing crisis at breaking point. At first there is nation under housing stress. Australia is facing a housing reality that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. According to new findings highlighted by realestate.com.au, around 60% of Australians are now experiencing housing stress or insecurity, a figure that represents not a minority, but a clear majority of the population. Housing stress is typically defined as spending more than 30% of household income on rent or mortgage payment. But the current crisis goes far beyond technical definitions. It has evolved into something more severe. A cost of living emergency driven by surging rents, low vacancy rates, and wages that have failed to keep pace. Renters are bearing the brunt of this crisis. Across major cities and regional centers alike, rents have risen sharply, often outpacing inflation. For many households, this has turned housing into the single largest and most inflexible expense in their budget. What makes this moment different is scale. Past housing downturns affected specific groups: low-income earners, young people, or those in certain cities. Today, teachers, healthcare workers, hospitality staff, single parents, and retirees are all being pulled into the same struggle. The report draws on data from the Everybody's Home Breaking Point study, which paints a grim picture. Australians are no longer cutting back on discretionary spending to afford housing. They are cutting back on necessities. This shift marks a dangerous threshold. When housing costs force households to sacrifice food, healthcare, or utilities, the issue stops being about markets and becomes about human well-being. Housing, once seen as a foundation of stability, is now a source of constant anxiety. For millions, every rent increase triggers fear. Fear of displacement, fear of debt, fear of homelessness. And as rents climb and vacancies shrink, that fear is no longer irrational. It is backed by data, lived experience, and a growing sense that the system is no longer working for ordinary Australians. Second comes choosing between rent and essentials. One of the most disturbing findings in the report is not just how many people are struggling, but how they are coping. According to the research cited by realestate.com.au, a significant proportion of Australians are now making severe sacrifices simply to stay housed. These are not lifestyle adjustments, they are survival decisions. Many households report reducing or completely cutting back on heating and cooling, even during extreme weather. This means enduring cold winters and scorching summers inside poorly insulated homes, conditions that directly affect physical health. Food insecurity has become widespread. Families are skipping meals, buying cheaper and less nutritious food, or relying on food banks and community charities. Around 1 in 5 Australians surveyed have sought help from charities just to cover basic needs. Healthcare is another casualty. People are delaying doctor visits, avoiding dental care, or rationing medications because rent takes priority. Preventable conditions are left untreated, increasing long-term health risks and pressure on the public health system. The report also highlights growing reliance on credit cards and buy now, pay later services to cover everyday expenses. While this may provide short-term relief, it traps households in cycles of debt that make future housing stress even worse. What's particularly alarming is that these behaviors are becoming normalized. People are quietly adjusting their expectations, telling themselves this is just how it is now. That quiet acceptance masks the depth of the crisis. Housing stress doesn't just reduce living standards, it erodes dignity. It forces people to hide their struggles, withdraw socially, and carry constant financial anxiety. This is the unseen cost of the housing crisis. It doesn't always show up as homelessness statistics, but it shows up in empty fridges, unpaid bills, declining health, and growing despair. The third is the health and human cost of insecure housing. Housing is not just shelter, it is a determinant of health. The report underscores how poor housing conditions are directly harming Australians' physical and mental well-being. Many rental properties lack basic standards. Inadequate insulation, faulty heating systems, drafty windows, and poor ventilation. When tenants cannot afford to heat or cool these homes properly, the risks multiply. Cold, damp housing is linked to respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular problems, and weakened immune systems. Extreme heat increases the risk of dehydration, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke, particularly among the elderly and young children. Mental health impacts are equally severe. Constant financial stress, fear of eviction, and housing insecurity contribute to anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders. Parents report guilt and distress over their inability to provide stable conditions for their children. Children growing up in housing stress environments face long-term consequences. Educational outcomes suffer when students lack quiet, safe, and stable places to study. Frequent moves disrupt schooling and social development. The report makes clear that housing insecurity is not evenly distributed. Low-income households, single parents, people with disabilities, and older renters are disproportionately affected. But the crisis is no longer confined to these groups. What we are witnessing is a systemic failure, where housing markets and policy settings have drifted away from their social purpose. When housing undermines health, the costs eventually spill into hospitals, schools, and welfare systems. In this sense, the housing crisis is not just a social issue. It is an economic one with far-reaching consequences. The fourth is why the crisis keeps getting worse. The report makes it clear that this crisis is not accidental. It is the result of long-term structural problems. Australia has failed to build enough homes to keep up with population growth. Planning delays, high construction costs, and declining new housing approvals have created a persistent supply shortage. At the same time, demand-side pressures, including population growth, investor activity, and policy incentives, continue to push prices higher. Rental vacancy rates remain critically low in many regions, giving tenants little bargaining power. Rent increases are often sudden and steep, leaving households scrambling to adjust. Wages, meanwhile, have not kept pace with housing costs. Even as inflation moderates, rents remain elevated, locking in stress for years to come. The report highlights that without meaningful intervention, these trends are likely to continue. Short-term relief measures may ease symptoms, but they do not address the root causes. This is why experts increasingly argue that housing supply, particularly social and affordable housing, must become a national priority. Without it, every economic shock, interest rate change, or population increase will deepen the crisis further. And then comes, who is most at risk and who is left behind? While the housing crisis affects millions, its impact is not equal. Low-income renters face the highest risk of eviction, homelessness, and chronic stress. Many are already at the edge, with no savings buffer to absorb rent increases. Older Australians who rent are particularly vulnerable. Without the protection of home ownership, retirees on fixed incomes are exposed to rising rents with limited options to increase income. Single parents, especially women, face compounded pressures, balancing housing costs, childcare, and employment in an increasingly unaffordable market. The report warns that without intervention, a permanent renter underclass may emerge. Australians who will never access stable, secure housing, regardless of how hard they work. This is a profound shift in the social contract. And at last, the sixth is the choice Australia must make. The evidence is clear, the data is confronting, and the consequences are already visible. Australia can continue down its current path, where housing consumes lives, wages, and well-being, or it can choose a different direction. Experts cited in the report argue that bold action is required. Large-scale investment in social and affordable housing, stronger renter protections, and policies that treat housing as essential infrastructure, not just an asset class. This is not about ideology. It is about outcomes. When the majority of a nation is choosing between rent and survival, the system is no longer functioning. The question now is not whether Australia has a housing crisis. It is how long the country can afford to ignore it.